Hi, I'm Sharon Waxman. I'm the editor of TheWrap, and I've brought together a few of our editors and writers to talk about an issue that we've been talking about in our newsroom, which has to do with the artistic community and drugs. Of course, this conversation has been started by the tragic death of Philip Seymour Hoffman, and we talk a lot about the losses that we've had because of drugs over the years of great artists, whether it's Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, or Corey Monteith more recently, or even Michael Jackson. But the truth is that there's a more complicated relationship between drugs and art, and we want to delve into that question a little bit. Are we, the reality is that a lot of artists do use drugs, and there have been some great works of art that have resulted. Is that fair to say, or is it just too taboo to even breathe anything about that? Steve, what do you think?
Well, I think, yeah, it's unquestionable that artists for centuries have used drugs, perhaps to fuel their creativity, perhaps just to remove filters that are preventing them from letting forth creativity that's already there. You know, for better or worse, you can't ignore the fact that drugs have been used as a creative tool, and often it's for much worse. But you know, it is something that has existed.
I mean, would we have the great music, some of the great music of the 1960s without drugs?
Thinking of music, you know, Eric Clapton made his greatest album, Layla, when he was a heroin addict. Did heroin had nothing to do with that. It was the romantic anguish he was going through that he was also using heroin to numb himself to that created that album. Heroin got in the way.
And I think there's a big difference between being on drugs and doing a performance, which has been done before. And there's a difference between someone who has done drugs, like psychological drugs, like mushrooms, for example, or LSD, and they can kind of, that shapes their worldview, that later on down the road they can use that, whatever that drug opened for them, whatever they saw while they're on a drug, they can use that in their art. They don't necessarily have to be using at the time or anywhere near when they create that art.
I mean, it's not just actors and it's not just musicians. You were bringing up before.
Well, some of the writers back in the Romantic age, they were the opium eaters. You had Coleridge and Shelley, all those people. Lord Byron, right. So they were using it. And I was just quickly refreshing my memory. They were criticized at the time, and some people said, well, their art isn't as good because they were under the influence. So can we really say it was a great creative accomplishment because they did it perhaps, well, under the influence? So,
what about Allen Ginsberg and, you know, some of the beat poets also more recently? I mean, was part of the whole experience, wasn't it? Or Hunter Thompson, another writer.
I think they were writing about art reflects reality. They were writing about their experiences on drugs. And reality of the world we live in, our culture, everyone, a large population is addicted to something. That whether it's a legal drug or an illegal drug, there's an experience that accompanies that from using it. So people, even on a comedic level like Seth Rogen, you know, Pineapple Express, are writing about that and creating stories and art based on those experiences, which are a reflection of reality.
I think it's tricky because we don't have a control group. There is no Jimi Hendrix who didn't take LSD so we can see what he would have produced if he hadn't. All we can see is what Jimi Hendrix produced when he was taking LSD. And so we don't know. He might have been just as great without it. We do know he probably wouldn't have died at age 27 if he hadn't been taking so many drugs. So, you know, it's very tricky.
Do we feel differently about heroin than we feel about alcohol, or somebody who takes a shot of whiskey before they go out on stage to, you know, quell their stage fright? Or
certainly. I think heroin is it's just a, you know, it's morphine. It's a debilitating drug. There's a great scene in a Philip Seymour Hoffman movie that perfectly illustrates it, Before the Devil Knows You're Dead, where he busts into his drug dealer's apartment, and, you know, there's a guy who's on heroin right there. He's just passed out. You know, he's in his own world, just escaping reality, as opposed to someone who does a shot. It has a much more minimal effect.
And there's been periods when it's been tacitly or overtly encouraged for people to indulge. I mean, there was the period when Cary Grant was under doctors. LSD was prescribed, and Cary Grant famously talked about how it helped. Oh yes, it was in the 50s before it became illegal.
And didn't the government test with LSD?
They did.
And it's a government-created drug, I think.
Well, what were they treating Cary Grant to prescribe him?
Well, he was seeing his shrink, and he was probably anxiety, or I don't remember exactly what it was, but you know, and that was like, yeah, this can help you.
That line of where we benefit as a culture from that complicated and fraught and, you know, dangerous game is something that I'm glad we got to talk about. So thanks for watching our conversation about art and drugs and a complicated relationship. Please join us in your comments, and we look forward to expanding the conversation.